I'm on the program committee at our people. We are very happy today to have a great talk on housing. But before we get started on that, typically we go around the table, just talk to introduce themselves briefly. We like to encourage, since this is just kind of a networking opportunity for people. So my name, again, is Jeff Petty, and I work with Ramsey County as a planner. And let's get to it because you're the speaker.
Oh, hello. My name is Kathy Elton, and I'm a resident here in St. Paul. And I have been the chair of the city advisory committee on aging. And very interested in pursuing housing for the aging community, in which I am on this. When I moved from my house, I've been in for 30 years. I wanted to stay in St. Paul, but not go to see.
I'm Eden Meisner, and I've just taken her position as chair of the advisory committee on aging.
I'm Stephanie Nelson-Duchek, and I actually work in Wild Research just upstairs and work on the homeless study.
I'm Kate Searles, Catholic Charities.
Jeff Aston with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota.
Ben Horowitz with the Community Development Department at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve.
Dennis Farmer, I'm a researcher at the Metropolitan Council.
I'm Matt Schroeder, also a researcher at the Metropolitan Council.
I'm Kirby Pittman, I'm with Minnesota Housing and Development.
Stephen Gillett, I'm a wild research in the country. Jake Riley, City of St. Paul for about 48 more hours, and then
I'm Jane Vanderpool, who's
Ryan Kelly with Livable Communities.
Tanya Westbacker with Hennepin County Community Works. I'm Dusty Sims.
Paul Walhart with the Department of Human Services.
Ben Boucher with Wild Research.
And our speaker today is Dan Hyland, who has Hilton, I'm sorry. Who's the research manager with housing. And they've done some work with Minnesota Housing about affordable housing, and they've had alternative stands.
Thanks. So I've worked with a handful of people in this room before, and I would say most of the people that know about me kind of from this room would know about the work that we do in the research world, which has to do with a few metrics that we provide and occasionally get involved in discussions around affordable housing in the region. Most of the people outside of this room that know about Housing Link know about us by virtue of our work providing resources for low to moderate income households and case managers who serve them. We have about 30 to 40,000 visitors a month to our website, primarily for an affordable housing search tool we have. So affordable listings, listings for vacancy on waiting lists, and other resources such as fact sheets or informational videos and so on that help people make better affordable housing decisions. And that's really the mission of Housing Link, whether it's in research or to the broader public, is to help people make better decisions regarding affordable housing. So I'm the research manager at Housing Link, as you do. So in 2007, we began work with the McKnight Foundation to develop a dashboard, really, of a number of affordable housing measures in Minnesota, from areas ranging from supply of affordable housing to foreclosure, what at that time was an alarming and growing trend of foreclosures, to ending long-term homelessness. We put out that report each year through 2012, kind of the tail end of the Great Recession. And as the state was emerging from the Great Recession, there remained the persistent issue of not enough affordable housing, but a lot of the specific areas of concern had shifted a little. Some of the measures, I wouldn't get too tight of the measures here because these go away, but some of them, like ending long-term homelessness, the measure was actually tied to a very specific funded initiative that mandated. So not only was maybe some of the specific focus for how to address that issue changing, the actual data that we were using to produce that measure was no longer available. In other instances like foreclosure, it's just not, the problem is tapered to the extent that obviously every individual foreclosure is a crisis, but overall it's not one of the primary state priorities at this time. And during this time, Housing Link had been developing our own suite of data offerings that we thought were worth bringing into the conversation. And so we decided to take this report out for a couple of years and consider how we might better reformat it to address some of the current priorities of the state. Also, concerning our own data, we thought it'd be good to have a report that was driven by our own data, partly because it's something that, being our data, that we can speak to a little more readily, feel more comfortable talking about, but also because it's not a bad idea to get your stuff out in front of people if you can. So we ended up developing a new housing measures report using 2012 as the baseline. We first put it out with data for 3 years, 2012 through 2014. To sort of soft publish it behind the scenes, we would get the McKnight Foundation and Imprimatur and load it up to our website, but without a lot of hoopla. And I guess this is the year that we're going to try going out a little more publicly with it, although this year's report is still, I'm still waiting for feedback from Eric Mushler at McKnight, which is not uncommon, but I'm open to other feedback that we get today on this report. And hopefully we'll have it turned around a little more quickly for data in the year ending 2017. So this is what the dashboard currently looks like, and far and away the primary driver of the report is the top two sort of rows of data. Naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH, which is of great interest to our region currently, as well as subsidized housing. The bottom two measures, gaps financing and funding for affordable housing, are actually holdovers from the old report. Frankly, they're in there kind of because it's something that we were always tracking. The data that contributed to those measures is still available. But one thing I've discovered the longer I've been at this work is how cyclical the nature of financing for affordable housing really is. And I'm still not convinced of the value of those two measures. And they're also available only at a statewide level, whereas the data at the top, we're able to dig down into some pretty granular areas of geography, and also it's our data. So those top two areas are really what I'm going to talk about today. So naturally occurring affordable housing, or we define as percent of private market rental listings that are affordable to 60% AMI. And subsidized housing, or in other words, publicly financed rental housing with permanent affordability. And by permanent, I don't mean like infinity, but it means that the affordability remains in the unit with subsequent residence. So it's affordable for a 15-year term or a 30-year term. They're obligated to keep rents affordable so that subsequent residents that move into the unit can live in an affordable apartment. And really, our data, our expertise is rental data, and far and away that's the type of housing that has most of an impact on low income households. So that's really where the focus of this report is. We'll start with talking about naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAH. Again, we define it as a percent of the private market rental listings affordable to 60% area median income. A lot of affordable housing programs really talk about things in terms of percent of area median income. 60% is a little arbitrary as a target that we're looking at, but our reasoning was that far and away the majority of affordable housing rental programs are targeted to groups in 60% AMI and below. There are some at 80%, but that starts to get into more of sort of a moderate income range, and in terms of the vast majority of housing programs, they are at 60%. So we thought in order to be able to kind of look at apples to apples between the private market of landlords that don't have any public financing in their properties and also the subsidized housing, we would use 60% for the private market. The data source for data in our private market analysis is our own Twin Cities Rental Review database. We have a database, we end up looking, I think it was 373,000 rental listings between the years of 2012 and 2016. The Twin Cities Rental Review has different bedroom sizes, median rents, in both the apartment market, which is multifamily, as well as the shadow market, which is that aspect of the rental market you don't commonly think of when you think of rental, but it's single family homes, duplexes, townhomes. And so we're analyzing all of the different sort of combinations of type of market and unit type. We have individual point level data. I was going to say something about, well, we'll go on. The data source for our Twin Cities Rental Review report is our housing search tool. We actually have listings that come into our organization that we publish on our website. However, our listing service is for affordable listings only, so not everybody makes the cut, and actually that only comprises a very small portion of our overall data set. But we have actual relationships with a number of management companies, anyone from Dominion to Pinnacle to even Renters Warehouse, which is really good for shadow market listings. We have arrangements where they will send us listing feeds, the same stuff that they're sending to Zillow or Rent.com, and not all of those rents would qualify for being published publicly on our website, but we're getting all that data. So we have wide exposure to an array of rents from affordable to luxury. And in the past, before the market started really spiking, our apartment markets, if you're familiar with Marquette Advisors, is sort of a leading market analysis firm in the cities that does tracking of the rents also. We tracked really closely in the multifamily, where actually our rents are higher now because we tend to show we're listings that are available, and a lot of listings that are hitting the market right now are more in the luxury area. So we actually show higher rents for multifamily than they do. But anyway, we have a number of management company feeds coming in. And then there's a arrangement we have with a listing aggregator that pulls from some other sources that we don't have otherwise exposure to, Craigslist and so on, that contribute to the report. 373,000 rental listings from 2012 to 2016 in bedroom sizes ranging from 0 to 4+, a variety of building types, and only those with a geocodable address. And probably most researchers in the room know geocodable, so like you can place an address on a map, which is really helpful for proximity analysis, and we end up using that in our work. So what is an affordable rent? Usually very much against a reading slide, but I will read. No more than 30% of the income of a household making 60% of the area median. So there aren't too many areas of consensus in the housing world, but a family or a household should spend no more than 30% of their income on housing costs. And that's a pretty accepted standard, ranging from how affordable housing programs are developed to how banks provide loans. Spending anything over 30% of a household income on housing is considered cost burdened. And so you really want to look at 30%, no more than 30% of income for housing to be affordable. And again, you mentioned that 60%, or I mentioned that 60% as a target earlier. So if you figure a household that is making at maximum 60% of the area median income, paying no more than 30% of their household income on housing, that's what our rent limit is for an affordable rent in this report. here's how we go about it. It's actually based, the beginning of this is based on Minnesota Housing Met Council methodology that assumes 1.5 people per bedroom. I have a couple of Met Council people that can tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but assuming 1.5 people per bedroom or 1 in studios, HUD actually provides household income by household size each year. And we're looking at 60% area median income by household size with these assumptions of the number of people in the household. And that's an annual income. You divide it by 12 to get a monthly income, and 30% of that is affordable rent. I see a couple people writing. Should I just hold on for a second? I'll move on to tell me if I anything. Actually, it's still there. So I was just take through a sample unit. So for 1 bedroom, you assume 1.5 people per bedroom, 60% AMI income. That's sort of like, yeah, that's not right. AM income by household size, provided by HUD. So I did the 1.5, so you could see that in the case of a 1-bedroom unit, I'm actually taking the midpoint of a 1-person household and a 2-person household, $34,710 for an annual household income, divided by 12, $2,893, and 30% of that is affordable rent for a month, $868. So any rental listing we have that's under $868 a month by our methodology is an affordable rent. However, we only get, the listed rents are not gross rents, and that 30% of housing cost is really a gross housing cost, not a net. So we want to add in utilities, and this is where we are fortunate that being a listing service where landlords are providing us with very specific information, there's a lot of complexity as to what utilities are going to be paid, because it can vary by the listing. In some instances, the landlord is responsible for the utility, and some a resident is. And as you can imagine, that varies by building type. So you're almost never going to be asked to pay for trash when you live in a multifamily apartment, whereas, or think about paying for your electricity, right? That does not happen in multifamily, but you're a lot more likely to in, say, a single family home. So what we've actually done is looked at, for a number of the listings that come directly to our website, landlords have indicated who's responsible, and we know the building type. So we've developed profiles by building type to help us estimate what is likely to be the case for instances where we don't know this. And then to know the amount that is paid for utility costs, we're actually using a payment standard sheet from the Metro HRA. So in order to help cover the cost in subsidized housing, local housing authorities will have sort of limits that utilities can cost for, depending on the type of property, the type of building, and the number of bedrooms. They have guidelines, and Metro HRA covers a number of jurisdictions in the metro area, and they seem like a good sort of standard by which to base our utility costs on. So we know when a listing hits us, we know the type, based on the bedrooms and the building type, we know who's probably responsible for the rent and how much those rents probably can cost as a maximum. And so then we add gross rent, or we add listed rent plus utilities to get a total gross rent and see whether it's less than that affordable rent that we established. And this is how it looks when it actually comes out into a data trend. This is in the Twin Cities. That's the 7 counties of Anoka, Carver, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, Scott, Washington. Did I get them all? 48% of all listings that we had exposure to in 2012 hit that affordable threshold. In 2016, that was down to an alarming 31%. The caveat I will make on this data is we are looking at rental listings, and I think it's important to note that that's distinct from occupied units. So you could have a family that's been living in an apartment the landlord, because it doesn't occur to them or because they're mission driven, they don't want to be mean, they don't raise the rent, and it just, the opportunity to raise rents for a landlord is when the unit is turning over and available to someone else. So our data tends to be pretty reflective of that open market and is a little more sensitive to rising rents for that reason. So in one way, that could be a criticism of our data, but I do say that it is the market that a renter is facing. If there's a unit that's been occupied for 5 years, that's not going to help somebody that's looking for an apartment right now. What that person is faced with is rental listings, and so that's what our trend follows. So now we'll talk about subsidized housing, which has much less attractive public finance rental housing with permanent affordability. Subsidized housing is a little bit of a misleading term. I was just thinking of this last night. It's sort of in the way that you say classical music when you include Baroque, which isn't like to a purist, it's not technically right, but subsidized implies that there is a subsidy to help cover the difference between what a resident can pay and what the actual rent should be. And in some cases, like public housing or project-based Section A, that's certainly the case. In some instances, the most notably low-income housing tax credits, also a lot of local projects that are done. It's more about having a rent that is affordable to a certain level of area median income. So it's more of a restricted rent than actual subsidy. For the purpose of this work, I'm grouping in everything that is affordable, again, to households making no more than 60% of the area median. So that ends up being 114,000 rental units in the state. Onto that, we would add 32,000 housing choices vouchers. So you may have, well, if you work in housing, you know all about them, but if you don't, you may have heard of Section 8 vouchers. So it's where a person gets on if it ever opens, they get on the waiting list, and then if they can wait until the 3 to 7 years till their name is called, then they are given a voucher that they can take into the private market and attempt to place in a private market landlord's rental unit. There has traditionally been no obligation by any landlord to accept a rental voucher. That will change for the city of Minneapolis in May as a result of an ordinance that was just passed, but traditionally there has been no obligation to accept a voucher, and the rent has to be at a level that's below the local PHA's maximum rent for a payment standard for that unit. So there's a couple barriers. Even if a renter gets a voucher, they may not be able to place it for one of a couple different reasons. And so that becomes a whole area of concern about placement of vouchers, where affordable housing opportunities are given availability of units that will accept them. And as you might guess, in a tight rental market, I think right now, according to Marquette Advisors, it tracks vacancy rates in multifamily. A healthy vacancy rate is around 5%, sort of for rental, and I think it's been below 3% overall for the Twin Cities since 2011. And so there's a lot of upward pressure on rents right now, and a lot of landlords just decide they don't want the hassle of dealing with the PHAs, or in some cases, maybe there's some discriminatory views toward voucher holders, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to place vouchers. But I do think this data element is the one piece in the report that of the rental housing market that doesn't come from us. It's really low-hanging fruit. It's available from HUD, from their picture of subsidized households. It's a public data portal. And they have the data in this beautiful, records that are aggregated to the census tract level with nice census tips and everything. And I don't really have to do a lot to it other than just sort of crunch it to geography. But I think you're missing a portion of the affordable housing picture if you're not counting those, because all those are vouchers that are in service and actually being utilized in the state. But as far as the first piece of that's 114,000 units in the state, the actual units, not the vouchers, but the what we call the permanent affordable units. We house those in a free, publicly accessible database called Streams. There's the URL at the bottom. Each year we talk to Minnesota Housing. We get databases from a variety of housing programs from HUD. We even talk to the USDA for their, I'm forgetting the rural development. That's not what it's called, but there's a program they have for greater Minnesota, or for, outstate regions, as well as St. Paul and the city of Minneapolis, and just all the primary developers of affordable housing in the state. And we do a lot of really messy work and try to end up with a single unduplicated database of properties and units. Once we get that initial draft out, then we start reaching out to some of the people that provided information that first time around, as well as a lot of local communities, counties, cities, a few nonprofit developers to say, what did we get wrong? Out to the city of Plymouth, here's what we saw happening last year in Plymouth. Did we get anything wrong? And from all that feedback, we end up developing this database, which always ends up being much later in the year than we wish it was. We published this one not till November this year, where every year we aspire to be much earlier in the year. But from here, you can see you have a number. Can you see these figures from the back pretty much? You have a number of different parameters you can search for, whether it's a federal funding source, state or local, whether it's a project-based subsidy, public housing, tax credit, so on, groups served, various date ranges for when the obligation to affordability ends to when a project receives its first financing, whether it's new construction or some other type of activity, which probably indicates preserving existing affordable housing that was about to lose its affordability. And you can zoom around into Google Maps, pull results based on the extent of the Google map, or go up to city search or greater Minnesota, which is a list of all cities and counties, like little check boxes. And you see that I want to go to Maplewood, and then you get summary stats right there. So total units, properties, total units by area median income served, and then you'll also get a list down kind of below the fold of all the properties. You can go into an intense level of individual property detail, or you can export the entire list as a CSV to do your own work. But this is the source of the data we use for the subsidized housing in this report. So the unit-based data, just talking about from our Streams database, the voucher-based data is available for you all at HUD. It's an odd title, but a picture of subsidized housing. And if you want to do your own work on federal housing, they have a number of other programs too. You can get public housing information, project-based or other multifamily assisted. But in Streams, we've kind of done the heavy lifting for people in the state of Minnesota, so there's no need. But you can always go back to the source. So I talked about the methodology for getting our private market listings data, as well as our subsidized data. Now I'm going to go a little bit into the geography that we work with in the report. I know some of these numbers and figures are going to be a little bit small, but I don't think it's that important to see them at the moment. There are very few data trends that I think are worthwhile looking at statewide level. We could say, like, overall there's not enough affordable housing or affordability is down, but another one of those things that's occurred to me the longer I've been in this type of work is how much data trends are a story of local markets. And I know looking at regions of the state, when I came on to Housing Link, our original version of this report had us looking at like the Arrowhead and Southeast and these giant regions. And I just don't think, I don't think that what's going on in Rochester necessarily impacts what's happening in the affordable housing market in Winona, for example. And this is not a perfect resolution as far as dashboard report, but we did decide to start working with CBSAs if anyone's familiar with those, core-based statistical area, I think. If anyone can confirm that? All right. A high degree of socioeconomic integration with an urban core. And I think what that means in effect is something like more commuters than not are commuting to a central urban core of some kind, so an agglomeration of counties, and with those sort of commuters depending on a central core, we thought that being sort of a nice stake in the ground. Also, looking at the top 5 CVSAs outside of the 7-county metro area to look at greater Minnesota. So Duluth, Moorhead, St. Cloud, Mankato, Rochester. After that, we look at balance of greater Minnesota, which isn't ideal, but we had to draw the line somewhere. You see some of the stats here coming into play. So our percentage of naturally occurring affordable housing, NOAA is the top line. Subsidized units, total subsidized housing inventory or housing stock for each area, plus new and preserved or stabilized units from the previous calendar year, and then the vouchers that are in use. Can people confirm for me? I'm guessing that you just simply cannot see these numbers from about halfway back. Is that right? People confirm? Okay. Question?
I'm just curious, for the greater Minnesota, do you use the state AMI, or do you have it targeted, aggregated?
I did, so I did for 7-county metro, I have a read, like there is a Twin Cities MSA AMIs that are provided, and then for the state, it was I'm just one guy, I couldn't do so I just did state, but there's like a state of Minnesota. So that was that was the way I approached it. And in an ideal world with a little more time and somebody helping me, I might have done individual MSAs. Then I think you run into, I think what had occurred to me is there any way I could do that? But then when you get into the balance of Minnesota, then you would have an agglomeration of counties, not all of which has the data provided, if that makes sense. Like, they give you Duluth and they give you Moorhead, but they wouldn't give you sort of all the counties that make up the remaining part of the state, and I wanted to keep that consistent with the state of Minnesota.
And so the Community Reinvestment Act does it, so it seems like a reasonable way to go.
Oh, okay. What I did.
Yeah.
And then we also, at the bottom, we threw in cost burden renters. So if you remember, I said anyone spending over 30% of their household income is cost burdened on housing costs. And that's not our data. It's something where I just pulled the data out of the American Community Survey and did it by the geography I'm looking at. But I love it as a measure because it simultaneously looks at both income and rents kind of in one fell swoop. It is, I think since I'm doing it at county levels, I think I'm able to get it at 1 year counts rather than that, if you're familiar with the ACS data where you have to do like the rolling 5 years if you get down to census tract level. But here I was able to look at it by the most recent year. And here's what the data looks like at the 7-county metro area, including, so the 7 counties plus the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. You'll also notice on the side McKnight Foundation is really interested in how this stuff all plays into transit. They've been having us look at transit networks for a number of years. We're looking at both fixed rail, which includes both light rail and bus rapid transit. It would have been the transit networks that are available on the Minnesota geospatial site, as the latest I had available when I was working on this, as well as high frequency bus corridors. And high frequency bus corridors, I believe that the definition is you don't need a schedule. You know that if you go and stand along the route, you'll get a bus in 10 to 15 minutes, something like that. And fixed rail. Oh, yes, you have a question?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine.
I'm just curious if anywhere in the report there's a sort of NOAA plus subsidized percentage, or is subsidized included in?
So in the report itself, there are a number of data tables at the end, and the calcs would be very simple, but I don't think I have them aggregated as such. Fixed rail transit we're doing our analysis within a half mile of transit stations. So I think the accepted methodology locally in the high frequency, casting looks over at Met Council. High frequency bus corridors, it's anywhere within a quarter mile of the actual, anywhere along the line. And that's where that geocodable database, the point level data is really helpful because you can't aggregate census tracts to, a half mile ring or a quarter mile buffer. So we're going to look at, that's all been methodology so far. I referred to this report as being a type of dashboard. So I know a lot of reports are based on like a research question or hypothesis or maybe advocacy based. And this is really about sort of checking in year after year on hopefully some data sources that will remain consistent, and people being able to see what they see and maybe explore their own research questions. I'm just going to identify some findings that I saw and we'll go from there. So I showed this chart already, the rapidly declining availability of affordable listings in the Twin Cities. 48 in 2012 down to 31 in 2016 with a precipitous drop from 2015 to 2016. Breaking that down a little more, so in the Twin Cities, down to 31%. Within half mile of fixed rail transit stations, it's down to 27%. But one interesting thing I noted here is in the overall market for the Twin Cities, it's down 17% since 2012, but in fixed rail transit, it's only down 14%. It's actually decreasing at a lower rate. And I know that there's been a tremendous amount of concern over gentrification in these areas specifically. So I think it's a story that, at least according to this data, the affordable rental listings seems to be holding pace, at least with the rest of the city, with the rest of the region. Looking at percent of affordable listings throughout the state. If you remember, well, here, 31% in the 7-county metro area, much higher in almost all of the regions of the state, 54% in Moorhead, 58% in Duluth, 65% in St. Cloud, 60% in Mankato. Only Rochester is much lower thanks to a 25% drop. This is just a one-year drop on this sheet. So from 2015 to 2016, precipitous drops in most of the greater Minnesota regions, all double digit, where in the 7-county metro, it was only an 8% drop. Yeah.
What's your guess for the cost of that? That's a big, I mean, it seems like a huge drop in a year, but is that because, and so you were showing the private market.
Yeah.
Is that because rents can go up because they can, because managers can get that much as the economy improves?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is that the vacancy rate for affordable properties is so low that they're just not reflected as much in our database. You know, again, because this is listings, we're really looking at listings that are available in the market. We know in the Twin Cities, there's a lot of new construction within like a mile of the downtown, each of the downtowns, and a lot, you know, those are listings that we're capturing. You know, there's a lot of, and this is why I know it's of such concern right now, there's a lot of incentive for people who own what are commonly called like Class B or Class C properties that are kind of aging, and that's that whole NOAA, naturally occurring affordable. They're affordable because of, that's just what the market is doing. They're maybe they don't have as many amenities, or they're in an area of town that's traditionally been considered a little less desirable, or maybe the owner's mission driven, but they're affordable because that's what market forces are allowing. But because there's such a demand right now for units and people seemingly willing to pay for them, there's a lot of incentive for those landlords when they have a unit open, or they'll convert units into more luxury ended or sell to somebody who will do that. So I think we're a lot of what we're seeing is new properties being built. And just, there's not, I think pretty much there's no, this might not be too bold of a statement. I don't think there's any NOAA properties being built. Because there's subsidized properties going up, but that's where rents are guaranteed, but nobody is like, I want to go out and build a property that charges affordable rents without any public financing in it. It's not happening. So this is subsidized housing change since 2012. The numbers here are pretty small. Nowhere is there a growth of over 3%, which is in St. Paul, but this is off a pretty big base. So there's like 70,000 subsidized units in the Twin Cities metro. And so St. Paul has seen a 3% growth in, doesn't necessarily mean 3% more units have been built, because it might actually mean more than that, because there might be some that for which an affordability period ended. And so it's a net growth of 3%. So Minneapolis and St. Paul tend to outperform the suburbs, with the exception of Ramsey County here, which is what? Roseville, Arden Hills, Maplewood, Sandus Heights, Little Canada. Right. Lauderdale. But yeah, with the exception of suburban Ramsey, St. Paul, and Minneapolis, well, St. Paul is outperforming too. But generally you're seeing more, some of that, so this goes into a whole, if you've heard of NIMBY, like the not in my backyard, and it can be very difficult to build affordable properties in suburban communities. Sometimes it's a matter of land, property values. Sometimes it's a matter of being able to sort of get community buy-in on it, and it seems like often a path of least resistance is headed back to the central cities. Although there also is a great need in the central cities, because that is where there's a greater concentration of people, low-income households, as well as a lot of properties that have been around for a number of years and are at risk of losing their affordability. So there is a need for trying to step in and preserve those. And I mentioned preservation. So there's building new construction, which is kind of like building units from the ground up. And then there's preservation, which the way we define it can take the form of either an existing affordable subsidized properties that the affordability period is running out, and there's new public financing that extends that affordability to sort of saves it from going to the private market, or else sometimes it's taking a private market apartment and converting it, like some public financing, converting it to an affordable property. It isn't unless they take that property and demolish it and then rebuild it that we're considering it new construction. And so, as you can see, preservation, which is the orange line, annually far outpaces new production, both in the Twin Cities and in greater Minnesota. It's probably as it should be, because it's a lot more cost effective to do preservation financing than it is to do new construction. I thought this was one of the few sort of hopeful stories that our data told. This is the growth of subsidized housing in proximity to transit. So this is the Twin Cities metro as a whole. We're looking at vouchers in use in orange and, wait a minute, there you go. And subsidized rental units in the blue. In proximity to transit areas, the growth is higher. And with subsidized rental units, there's just been a lot of attention by partners in affordable housing in the region to try to, as I said, to stave off the gentrification that's feared. This looks like that has been a success to some extent. That there's been actually not only stabilized, but a growth in the base of subsidized affordable housing close to transit areas. And the vouchers in use is actually shocking to me, because I would expect this, remember, this has everything to do with where landlords will allow vouchers, and they're not compelled to do so. And if landlords were seeing their property as like, I could get anyone to live here and I want to turn it into a luxury unit, you wouldn't think you would be seeing voucher use that would be outpacing growth that would outpace that of Metro. Yeah.
I would just say that that probably has to do with the fact that the low income tax credits, the home program, all those programs require that they do take vouchers.
Okay.
And so almost all of us have some kind of priority
For new housing, we built near the transit station.
Okay.
We see a lot of funding going into the newer projects along the line.
I would say that that's one important thing that should be noted, that we're probably double dipping subsidized housing and low-income housing tax credit if it's a listing that can hit the open market. So to the extent that low-income housing tax credit properties are hitting, although usually they're leased up for your, yeah, so there's probably not a ton that we're seeing in our listing service, but certainly they're both gonna be in our subsidized rental database, and if they're there, then they're also, that's where vouchers are being used, so that's a fair point. If there is a higher number of subsidized properties, it will follow that some of those are accepting vouchers. I don't think any of the subsidized programs that take the deep discounts, like the public housing or project-based Section 8, they cannot take a voucher, right? Okay. So it's, yeah. So it's more like tax credit properties are usually at 60% of area median income for those units.
A lot of times we fund them to try to get some of those lower units too.
Okay.
You see some targeting other additional units. 60% is a tax credit, but then there's a 50% usually incentive for them to do that.
Got it,
And
okay.
A lot of times our additional funding gets to that lower, some of those homeless units or the lower.
Yeah.
Help them pay the debt that they can't afford on those units.
Okay. Thank you for that. This is actually the last finding slide I have. This is, I mentioned that like one of my hopes would be that people would find data trends in here that would make them sort of explore their own research questions. This is one that I want to look into this next year. This is a change in vouchers in use in Greater Minnesota. It's just skyrocketing in those 5 CBSAs we're looking at, down in the balance of Greater Minnesota, and I should probably have the population of the regions up there, because the balance of Greater Minnesota, actually the population far exceeds the aggregate population of those other regions. And so I'm wondering if there's a lot of sort of in-migration to those Greater Minnesota CBSAs from the balance of Greater Minnesota, or if there is a lot of difficulty in placing vouchers in the Twin Cities. I wonder if some people are actually fleeing to Duluth, to Rochester, to St. Cloud to place vouchers because they can't. And there's a whole thing there about porting out of one public housing authority and porting into another. And they're pretty close with their data, the public housing authorities tend to be, but it's something that I'd actually like to take a look at in 2018 to see what sort of migration patterns we're seeing with voucher holders. Yeah. Oh, I thought you had a question.
And they probably are, because those are also, good places for work.
Yeah.
You get the benefit of doing the voucher and so that's opportunity.
Right. That is all I have for my presentation. As a reminder, the NOAA data comes from our Twin Cities Rental Review. In full disclosure, that is a paid product. It's like $469 a year for 4 quarterly reports. But this, obviously, this report will be going up soon. The unit-based data is free from us, comes from our streams database, and the voucher data comes from HUD. And that's my name and contact information. I had thought about maybe sending around a sign-up sheet, so I started an informal thing this last year, just using MailChimp. Like people that want to be informed of when I have a research thing coming out, like maybe an email every couple months or something. If you're interested in being on that and getting information when I have it coming out, it'll be like, hey, we have a new stream that's being published, or some other thing like Housing Measures comes out. Please send me an email or give me a call or whatever, and I'll put you on that list. And I guess that's it. Any questions? Yeah.
Will, if Congress passes a tax bill that will take away the deductibility of donations and property tax,
I know that funding for the tax credit housing program is also threatened, and just sort of afford, like, what's gonna happen in HUD in general for funding a lot of those programs. I don't know details around what if you're talking about like that, they're thinking about taking away the property tax. Right. Okay.
Deductibility.
Okay.
Essentially, they're saying is that they would give you a bigger general deduction, so you don't have to do as much itemizing. Kind of their thought, I think. You know, figure that, but then you wouldn't get to write off kind of that sales tax and property tax stuff that you get to now.
Yeah.
Do itemization.
I think most of what's going to impact this is anything that's done for, like, you know, multifamily housing and a lot, well, I know in the past we've had some tax incentives that were sort of state-based, but it's kind of out of an area of my expertise, so I probably should speak up.
Just to address that real quick, I think the biggest threats I've read about to affordable housing are in the House. They want to get rid of private activity bonds for use on a lot of projects, and also the corporate tax rate itself. One developer said that in Minnesota said the conventional wisdom is a 1% drop in the corporate tax rate leads to a 1 cent reduction in the value of LIHTC. So because corporations won't need to offset as much tax burden, there's less interest in the like secondary market for those credits. And so he said on his typical project that level of reduction they're looking at would cost about $1.5 million. A pretty big hit. And actually, that same developer, I'm interested in. It's great that you're highlighting NOAA in these dashboards, and I just a comment, I guess. It seems like a lot of the talk around NOAA right now is how there's this sweet spot of housing that came online in the 80s, because that's where you can still find a cheap enough development that you can afford to buy it, and it's not so old that you need to put in a lot of money in terms of renovation. So I don't know if any of your data would have that kind of capacity to give some kind of feeling on how the NOAA going offline, how old it is.
Yeah, the only way would be is if we could marry our data to a database that has age of building. I know we did some work with Greater Minnesota Housing Fund a couple of years ago where they got I forget what it was a private data source where they had, it wasn't CoStar, but it was one of those private market analysis places that had, like, theoretically every multifamily of 4+ units in the metro, but typically those are under such strict data restrictions that you can sort of do your analysis, but you can't share it, or you can't do a whole lot with the data. But
would your data match up with county assessor?
Yeah.
Data, things like that would.
Yeah. So and then I know it's a big deal because we've looked at for other purposes, looking at like trying to figure out how many units are in some of these properties because we know only a listing in the property, and I know the varying counties have varying levels of completeness for some of those data fields. So I don't know where they're at for like age of building, but yeah, certainly that would be something we could look at. As well as maybe, an EVA, so like the value of the property and seeing sort of based on rent changes we see, and has there been like a value change in the property or something. So feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk about something like that. Yeah.
Thinking about the use of parcel data for that, notice that sometimes conversion, the year built doesn't change in the parcel field. So if there's I don't know what one is, Schmidt Brewery, maybe, that would still have a year built from way back in the 100 years ago, even though the units themselves are pretty new. So just a caution there, I guess. But I was wondering, I haven't really used the National Housing Preservation Database very much, but I was wondering if anyone else has, and whether that might be a resource for getting the age of building.
I'll say actually for age of building, do you know, Jeff, because I know you've been talking with them.
in the National Housing Preservation Database?
It'll be subsidized only though.
I don't remember it having age of building. It does have when it's scheduled to go offline though.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that can-
Although we have that in streams, but that's really only about like the subsidized, if you're talking about private market.
Yeah.
Right?
Jason? Well, I was gonna say you have an incomplete set of data on when things expire.
Sure, yeah, in some instances,
Probably that's our fault.
worth noting, so, yeah, we only can report the data that we're given in some instances. We put a date in there usually, but in some instances, we're estimating expiration date of an affordable property based on the type of program that's in there and the most likely outcome for that on expiration, but in some instances, and we do indicate that in the database, we have an expiration estimated flag on data.
And I actually had a question and a thought after hearing this conversation about building a valuation system. Wondering if there's a good research project for something like Kira or someone for research to look at the building permit data and how that is influencing the unit, right? So Pittsburgh is a really great example of that, from having no one living there to having many people living there. Many of those units are subsidized, right? So you use the building to do that. And that should happen to account for where that is. So again, long term. But I had a question about the HUD, figure out subsidized household, and the voucher data. Does that, do you match that with the Metro HRA, with the St. Paul, PHA, with all the others? Make sure that you're capturing?
I believe that the last I knew, when we used to get data from the individual PHAs, and we were getting it was on allocated, and we weren't able to get, like, City of St. Paul is all, because we've done some special work for them on Section 8 management, sort of like looking at individual addresses and whether they're in high or low poverty. That's the only PHA I've ever worked with that had any interest in us seeing address level data. So that isn't really, we only ever got total allocated by PHA. The only place I've ever found vouchers utilized is from HUD, from the national.
And they don't have the other half of that vouchers for.
They don't. So, yeah, I mean, I think PHAs, if you call them, they will tell you how many vouchers were unable to be placed, and you can get that information. Asking every PHA in the metro for information could become a whole half of your year. Sure.
Can I just say something on that? So from Washington County, I think it is allocated, because you had 447 for us, and we have another 900 that are poured in from other places.
Did that look pretty accurate, in use?
No, we have 447 that are ours, and then another 900 in use that are from, they got their voucher from Minneapolis and they moved to Washington County.
And that's not reflected in the
No.
data? Wow, so that's an important thing to learn.
So if you reached out to us, we'd be happy to share that information.
Thank you. Yeah, and I gotta find out if that's if and how that is tracked federally in any way, because obviously you're letting them know that. Yeah, okay.
Well, it's 1 o'clock, and we're going to be timely, so those who need to leave, can do that now. We do have this room for another 20, 30 minutes.